Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 12 Legitimation and Obligation. Our topic is why obey the government and overview. The obedience to a government is not merely a legal phenomena, it is also a political one. People obey a law more because of the fact that they feel it is good to obey it, as also because they are convinced that the government issuing the laws is a legitimate one. In fact, no one would like to obey a government which one feels is not a legitimate one. The obedience to the government is more of the political phenomena than a legal one. If one stands up to disobey the government, it is because one does not want to obey the government. If obedience is voluntary, or so is the unwillingness to obey the laws. Generally, people obey the laws. They do so because they accept the government that rules them. They do so because they accept the system wherein the government operates. And if they like to disobey the government, they do so because they hesitate to accept both the government and the system as a whole. Legitimacy of states and governments depend on how the people look at them and also at the social world around and what they consider to be morally right. What they consider morally proper is the product of numerous factors which influence the people. The total effect of all the influences make up which may be called the legitimation process. Legitimacy, once evolved or grown, is not a matter of all future. It is a process which goes on and on. The state goes on because the people want it to go on. The state, one must remember, goes on not because it has power. The overwhelming power does not last on its own. It has to have the acceptance and support of the people. It has to have its own strength, which is much more than the physical force that it has. What it means is that the state have to have their legitimacy, that is, the government rules over the people because it has the legitimate right to rule. Now let us move to the next point, that is legitimation and obligation basis of paternalism. There are numerous bases which make a particular type of government extract obedience from the people. If other words, legitimation of the state and government to rule people and the obligation of people to obey the government have their grounds in numerous theories. One such theory may be termed as paternalism, one that can best be expressed in the divine right theory of the kings as well as the charismatic theory. The divine right theory advocates that the power the rulers as kings have was given to them by God. The kings rule because God authorizes them to rule. They have the right to rule the people because God has given them the power to rule. The basis of the authority of the king is religion, which makes the state a divine institution. Legitimacy in such a theory lies in kings having power as ordained by God. The people are the divine right theory claims obliged to obey the kings. Their disobedience does not only constitute a crime, it also constitutes a sin. Absolute obedience is a characteristic feature of the divine right theory. People resistance is regarded as a rebellion against the divine rule. The divine right theory, despite its demerits, prevailed as a gospel truth, constituting legitimacy of the rulers and also the obligation of a people to obey the divinity appointed rulers. Such a theory provided a framework of legitimation and obligation. The kings ruled as the legitimate holders of powers, and the people accepted them and obeyed them, considering all this as a phenomena willed by God. Religion, as the prominent factor of divine theory, legitimatized both the monarchical absolute rulers and the obligation of the people to obey them. There is a form of paternalism known as, to use Weber's term, charismatic authority. Charismatic authority is a personal authority related to a very personality of the person having power. Such a person has power by the sheer dint of his dominant personality. Whoever Thomas MacPherson says has power may be thought to have a right to it. We hear, he continues, of men with magnetic personalities, of born leaders, and so on. The argument runs as follows. At times, particularly times of crisis, people want to be led and will respond to someone who has the confidence to put himself forward as their leader. Wesley, Hitler, Churchill, history witnesses a form of charismatic authority where people willingly obey or confer authority on some leaders whose strength lies in the very personality of a person. Such persons are generally known as charismatic leaders. People accept them as leaders and give their obedience to them because of some extraordinary personal qualities, because they represent some ideas with extraordinary clarity. Charismatic is as such a form of paternalism. Traditionalism too sounds as yet another example of paternalism. In the earliest societies, people accepted the power of some people over themselves because they would believe that these rulers have been followed from times immemorial. People obey because they have been traditionally obeying. Obedience becomes a matter of practice. Acceptance of such authority is also a matter of traditionally based belief. Now let us move to the next point, that is legitimation and obligation, basis of contract. The contract theory, as advocated by the contractualist especially Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, offers another ground for legitimacy of the government and the obligation of the people to obey the government. To some extent, this theory sets forth a legal or a quasi-legal basis of legitimation and obligation. We ought to obey the government because we have entered into a contract to do so. If that was really so, there would have emerged accepted obligations of obeying and ruling. The contract theory provides a legitimation thesis which states that the government rulers because of the title it has to rule, whether that title has been bestowed upon the Levitian in the case of Hobbes as through an agreement that the state protects the rights of the people as in the case of John Locke, or through a government based on the general will, as Rousseau would want us to believe. The state has the power to rule over the people as per the contract entered into by the people. This very contract theory also provides an argument for people's obligation to obey the government, this too through the grounds of contract. The contract theory may not be taken too far to investigate the possibility of whether such a contract was ever made or not. What may only be inferred is a legal right of the state to rule the people and a legal duty of the people to obey the state. There is no doubt that the state exists because it has to establish law and order. Its essence lies in the external relations it maintains with the people residing in its area. There is thus the legal framework at its base through which people demonstrate formal relationships. The state rules in accordance with the procedure established by law and what the law of the land, that is, the Constitution, expects from it. The contract theory legalizes the state and gives its legitimacy to govern the people as a matter of title. On the other hand, the contract theory also legalizes the procedure of people obligation to obey the state. People obey the state for the contract demands from them an obligation that they are legally bound to comply with the orders issued by the state. What this theory establishes is the legal relationship between the rulers and the ruled, binding the former to rule the latter, binding the latter to obey the former. This theory indeed leaves no scope for non-compliance. Non-compliance is followed by punishment. Legal and lawful authority, rule of law, legally oriented framework, and a set of legal obligation, and the like are some of the characteristics of the contract theory. Now let us move to the next point, that is legitimation and obligation, basis of consent. There is a close resemblance between the contract and consent theory as the basis of issues related to legitimation and obligation. The contract theory, though legal or quasi-legal, indicates to some extent the consent phenomena, as the consent theory indicates to some degree the quasi-legal base of administration. In the context theory's argument, the element of people's consent as the basis of administration cannot be dismissed. Locke says, "Men being by nature all free, equal and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent." A person, one may clearly infer, is not obliged to obey unless he has voluntarily agreed to do so. Locke seems to imply that not only does the founding of a government require consent, but that every governmental act affecting a person's life and rights requires consent. He writes, "The supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent." Locke's argument is that nothing should be demanded by an individual that does not accord with his uncoerced and conscious will. Rousseau's theories of general will can be stated as another example of consent. A government deserves, Clantinder says, obedience if its commands conform to what Rousseau called the general will. The point is, he continues to sum up Rousseau's thesis that the theory of the general will tells us that a government has a legitimate claim to obedience only when its commands represent the true ultimate interest of all people. Without going into the fallacies, the consent and the general will theories have what one may be interested in so far as the legitimation and obligation contexts are concerned is that consent at the base of the founding of the state makes the government legally empowered to make the laws for the people and compels the people to obey those laws for reasons of their explicit consent. The same is true about the general will theory as well. The government is legitimately authorized to govern the people, for it works for the interest of the people, and the people are obliged to obey the government, for their obedience leads ultimately to the attainment of the common interest. However, the consent and contract theory help evolve a democratic spirit that brings legitimation of the governmental laws and the people's obligation closer to each other. The government rules because the people want it to rule. The people obey because the government rules for them. The democratic consent itself gives legitimation to the government on one hand and demands people's obligation to obey the government on the other. Here we want to wind up today's lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.